The autumn rain drummed steadily against the windows of St. Margaret's funeral home. As funeral director Elizabeth Hartwell reviewed the sparse arrangements for tomorrow's service. In her 23 years of managing funerals, she had seen many sad situations, but few as heartbreaking as the service planned for Harold Edmund Whitfield, a 91-year-old veteran who had passed away peacefully in his sleep at a local care facility. Harold's file lay open on Elizabeth's mahogany desk, revealing the stark reality of a life that had ended in solitude. No next of kin had been located despite extensive searches through military records and genealogy databases. The care facility had contacted the local council, who had arranged for a basic funeral service funded by the government's provisions. For unclaimed veterans, the service was scheduled for 2 p.m. the following day, with an estimated attendance of 0. Elizabeth had handled pauper funerals before, but something about Harold's story troubled her deeply. According to his military service record, he had served with distinction in the Korean War as a member of the Royal Engineers. He had been awarded several medals, including the United Nations Service Medal and the Korea Medal, indicating he had seen active combat during one of Britain's forgotten conflicts. After the war, Harold had worked as a construction engineer, never married, and had lived quietly in a small flat in South London until his health declined. His landlord had found him unconscious in his apartment 3 months earlier, leading to his admission to the care facility where he spent his final days. The staff described him as a gentle, polite man who rarely spoke about his past, but always thanked them for their care. The funeral arrangements were minimal: a simple pine coffin, a brief service in the chapel, and burial in a shared grave at the municipal cemetery. No flowers had been ordered, no obituary published, no family contacted because there was no family to contact. Harold Edmund Whitfield would leave this world as quietly as he had lived in it, with no one to witness his departure or remember his service to his country. Elizabeth closed the file and walked to the window, watching the rain create rivulets down the glass. Tomorrow's weather forecast called for more of the same gray, dreary conditions that seemed fitting for such a lonely farewell. She had seen too many veterans buried without recognition, their sacrifices forgotten as time moved forward and younger. Generations focused on their own lives. At the Household Cavalry Barracks across London, 24-year-old Lance Corporal James Mackenzie was finishing his evening duties when he overheard a conversation between 2 older non-commissioned officers, discussing the upcoming funeral of a Korean War veteran. The mention of the war caught his attention because his own grandfather had served in Korea, though he had rarely spoken about his experiences there. "Shame, really," Sergeant Major Collins was saying to his companion, another old soldier going to his rest with nobody to see him off. "These Korea lads never got the recognition they deserved when they came home. Everyone was tired of war after the Second World War, so Korea got forgotten." James paused in his cleaning, listening to the conversation that would soon change everything. "About tomorrow's funeral? Where's the service being held?" James asked, approaching the senior NCOs respectfully. Sergeant Major Collins looked up with slight surprise. "St. Margaret's in Southwark, son? Why the interest?" "My grandfather served in Korea, Sergeant Major. I was just thinking that maybe someone should be there, to represent the regiment, show some respect." The older man nodded approvingly. "Good thinking, Mackenzie, but you'd need permission from the company commander, and it's not exactly official business." James had joined the Household Cavalry straight from school, driven by a sense of duty instilled by his grandfather's stories of military service. His grandfather, Robert Mackenzie, had served in the Royal Scots during the Korean conflict, and had often spoken about the brotherhood among soldiers, how they looked after each other, both in combat and in peace. A soldier should never be buried alone, his grandfather had once told him. "We make promises to each other that go beyond our time in uniform." That evening, James approached his company commander, Captain William Harrison, about attending Harold's funeral. Captain Harrison was a career officer who understood the importance of military traditions and the bonds between serving soldiers and veterans. "Mackenzie, this isn't a regimental funeral or an official duty," Captain Harrison explained. "If you attend, it would be on your own time and in civilian clothes." "I understand, sir. I just feel that someone should be there. Someone who understands what his service meant." Captain Harrison studied the young lance corporal for a moment. James had proven himself to be a dedicated soldier with a strong sense of honor and duty. His request spoke to the values the regiment tried to instill in all its members. "Permission granted, Mackenzie. Take tomorrow afternoon off." "And son?" "Yes, sir." "Wear your dress uniform. If you're going to represent all of us, do it properly." As James left his commander's office, he felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. He had never attended a funeral for someone he didn't know, but something about Harold's situation resonated with him. Perhaps it was his grandfather's influence, or perhaps it was the military oath to never leave a comrade behind, even in death. That night, James carefully prepared his dress uniform, ensuring every button was polished and every crease was perfect. Tomorrow, he would stand as witness to the life and service of a man he had never met, but whose sacrifice had helped secure the freedoms James now defended. What he couldn't have imagined was how his simple act of respect would transform a lonely funeral into something extraordinary. The morning of Harold's funeral dawned gray and somber, with a persistent drizzle that seemed to reflect the sadness of the occasion. James woke early, as was his habit from years of military training, and spent extra time preparing his dress uniform, a scarlet tunic, dark blue trousers with gold stripe, and polished boots represented not just his own service, but the respect he wished to show for a fellow soldier. At St. Margaret's funeral home, Elizabeth Hartwell arrived to find the chapel empty except for the simple pine coffin positioned at the front. She had hoped against hope that someone might appear for Harold's service. Perhaps a distant relative or an old friend from his working days. But her experience told her this was unlikely. The chapel could seat 60 people, but today it would echo with emptiness. Elizabeth placed a single wreath of white lilies near the coffin, purchased with her own money because she couldn't bear the thought of Harold departing without any flowers. The military service records she had received showed a photograph of Harold as a young soldier, handsome and proud in his Royal Engineers uniform. A stark contrast to the elderly man who had died alone. James arrived at the funeral home 30 minutes early, his breath visible in the cold autumn air as he walked through the car park. His dress uniform drew curious glances from passers-by, but he maintained the military bearing that had been drilled into him during training. As he approached the entrance, Elizabeth spotted him through the window and felt a surge of relief and gratitude. "Excuse me," James said politely as Elizabeth met him at the door. "I'm here for the service for Harold Whitfield." Elizabeth's eyes welled with tears at the sight of the young soldier. "You're the first person to arrive for Harold. Are you family?" "Oh, ma'am," James replied respectfully. "I'm Lance Corporal Mackenzie from the Household Cavalry. I heard about the service and felt that someone should be here to represent his military family." Elizabeth led James into the chapel, explaining what little she knew about Harold's life and service. As they talked, James learned that Harold had been involved in major engineering operations during the Korean War, helping to build bridges and fortifications under enemy fire. His medals indicated he had shown considerable courage and dedication during his service. "He deserved better than this," Elizabeth said softly, gesturing to the empty chapel. 40 years I've been arranging funerals, and I've never gotten used to seeing our veterans forgotten like this." James examined the simple order of service Elizabeth had prepared, noting Harold's military service details and the few personal facts that had been uncovered. Born in 1932, served 1951 to 1953, worked as a civil engineer until retirement. The bare facts of a life that had undoubtedly contained much more richness and meaning than could be captured in a few sentences. At 1:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the scheduled service, an unexpected development began to unfold. A black sedan pulled into the car park, followed by another, then a third. From these vehicles emerged men in their 70s and 80s, some walking with canes, others moving slowly but with determined purpose. Elizabeth watched in amazement as the elderly men entered the funeral home. The first to approach her was a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and a carefully maintained military bearing despite his obvious age. "Good afternoon," he said with a slight Welsh accent. "I'm David Roberts, formerly Corporal Roberts of the Royal Engineers. We're here for Harold Whitfield's service." Behind David came 6 other elderly men, each introducing themselves as former members of various regiments who had served during the Korean War era. They had learned about Harold's funeral through veterans networks and had traveled from across London and the surrounding counties to pay their respects. "How did you know Harold?" Elizabeth asked, overwhelmed by this unexpected arrival. "We didn't know Harold personally," David explained, "but we knew men like him, served in the same war, faced the same dangers, came home to the same indifference. When we heard one of our own was being buried alone, we couldn't let that happen." James felt a profound sense of awe as he met these elderly veterans. They represented the living memory of Harold's generation, men who had answered their country's call during a difficult and often overlooked conflict. Their presence transformed the atmosphere of the chapel from lonely desperation to dignified remembrance. At precisely 2 p.m., the funeral director began the service. What had been planned as a brief, impersonal ceremony became something much more. Meaningful as the veterans shared memories of their own service in Korea, David Roberts spoke about the harsh conditions, the camaraderie among the engineers, and the vital work they had performed in rebuilding infrastructure destroyed by war. Harold Whitfield was one of thousands of young men who left comfortable homes to serve in a distant land, David said, his voice strong despite his age. They built bridges under fire, cleared mines from roads, and helped create the infrastructure that allowed our forces to operate effectively. Harold's service mattered, and his sacrifice should not be forgotten. Another veteran, Thomas Chen, had served with the Royal Corps of Signals and spoke about the bonds formed between soldiers during wartime. "We may not have known Harold personally, but he was our brother in arms. The Korean War may have been forgotten by many, but those of us who served there remember the courage and dedication of men like Harold." As the service continued, James realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. These elderly veterans had made the effort to honor a comrade they had never met, demonstrating the enduring bonds of military service that transcend individual relationships. Their presence had transformed a lonely farewell into a celebration of service and sacrifice. The chapel, which had been silent and empty just hours before, now resonated with stories, memories, and the dignified presence of men who understood the true meaning of Harold's life. Elizabeth wiped away tears as she realized that sometimes the most meaningful tributes come from unexpected sources, and that the brotherhood of military service extends far beyond active duty service. As the funeral service continued, more unexpected arrivals began to appear at St. Margaret's Chapel. Word had somehow spread through the local community that a Korean War veteran was being honored, and people began arriving who had no direct connection to Harold but felt compelled to show their respects. Mrs. Margaret Thompson, an 84-year-old widow who lived near the funeral home, entered quietly and took a seat in the back row. She had lost her husband in the Falklands conflict 30 years earlier and understood the importance of honoring military service. Behind her came the Reverend Michael Patterson from the local parish church, who had heard about the service from one of his parishioners and felt called to offer prayers for a soldier he had never met. James watched in amazement as the chapel continued to fill. A group of current serving soldiers from various regiments had somehow learned about the gathering and arrived in their dress uniforms, creating a visual bridge between Harold's generation and the modern military. Among them was Sergeant Sarah Collins from the Royal Logistics Corps, whose own grandfather had served as a combat engineer in Korea. "I couldn't let him be buried without proper military honors," Sergeant Collins whispered to James as she took her seat. "My grandfather always said the engineers were the unsung heroes of that war." The funeral director had to open additional seating areas to accommodate the growing crowd. What had been planned as a 5-minute service for an audience of none was expanding into a full memorial celebration with nearly 40 attendees, each drawn by different motivations, but united in their desire to honor Harold's service. David Roberts, the elderly Royal Engineers veteran who had become the unofficial spokesman for Harold's military contemporaries, approached the podium again to share more details about the Korean War experience. His voice carried the authority of someone who had lived through the events he described. The Korean War was called the Forgotten War because it came so soon after the Second World War. David explained to the assembled crowd, People were tired of conflict, tired of loss, tired of sacrifice. When we came home, there were no parades, no celebrations, no recognition. We simply returned to civilian life and got on with things, as soldiers do. He paused, looking around the now crowded chapel with obvious emotion. But today, seeing all of you here for Harold, I realized that perhaps we weren't as forgotten as we thought. Perhaps the delay in recognition makes today's tribute even more meaningful. James felt deeply moved by David's words and the extraordinary transformation of this funeral. His simple decision to attend had somehow catalyzed a community response that none of them could have anticipated. The empty chapel had become a gathering place for people who understood that service and sacrifice deserve recognition. Regardless of how much time has passed, among the unexpected attendees was Dr. Patricia Wells, a military historian from King's College London who had been researching the Korean War for a new book. She had learned about the funeral through her contacts in the veterans community and saw it as an opportunity to pay respects to the generation she had been studying. Harold represents thousands of young men who served in Korea, Dr. Wells said when invited to speak. They were called up for national service or volunteered for regular army service during a critical time in our nation's history. The work done by Royal Engineers like Harold was essential to the war effort, often performed under dangerous conditions with little recognition. She had brought with her a folder of research about the Royal Engineers' role in Korea, including photographs and documents that helped put Harold's service into historical context. The audience learned that engineers like Harold had built temporary bridges while under artillery fire, cleared minefields to make roads safe for supply convoys, and constructed defensive positions that saved countless lives. Elizabeth Hartwell watched the proceedings with wonder and gratitude. In all her years of funeral directing, she had never seen a service transformed so dramatically from its original conception. The simple pine coffin now seemed to represent not just Harold's individual journey, but the shared experience of an entire generation of servicemen, whose contributions had been overlooked for too long. The local newspaper's community reporter, Jenny Martinez, had arrived after hearing about the unusual funeral through social media posts from some of the attendees. She quietly took notes and photographs, recognizing that this story represented something significant about community, its memory, and the way societies honor their veterans. As the formal service concluded, something remarkable happened, and serving soldiers began to form an impromptu honor guard around Harold's coffin. Without planning or coordination, they instinctively arranged themselves in military formation, creating a corridor of respect that would have made any regimental sergeant major proud. James found himself positioned at the head of the honor guard, his dress uniform representing the bridge between Harold's era of service and the continuing tradition of military dedication. As they prepared to accompany Harold to his final resting place, James felt the weight of responsibility that came with representing not just his own regiment, but the entire military community that had gathered to honor a forgotten soldier. The procession that formed outside St. Margaret's funeral home bore no resemblance to the lonely burial that had been planned just hours earlier. Veterans walked alongside active-duty soldiers. Community members followed behind clergy. And historians documented a moment that captured something essential about British values and the importance of remembering those who serve what had begun. As one young soldier's simple desire to ensure Harold wasn't buried alone had become a powerful demonstration of how individual acts of respect can inspire community action and transform private grief into public recognition. The procession to Southwark Cemetery moved through the London streets with unexpected dignity and solemnity. The hearse carrying Harold's coffin led the way, followed by the military honor guard and the growing crowd of mourners who had come to pay their respects to a man they had never known but whose service they deeply valued. As they walked, passersby stopped to observe the unusual sight. The combination of elderly veterans, active-duty soldiers in dress uniform, and community members created a visible representation of the continuity of military service across generations. Some onlookers removed their hats or stood at attention, instinctively recognizing the significance of what they were witnessing at the cemetery. The graveside service was conducted by Reverend Patterson, who had prepared remarks appropriate for a military funeral, despite having only learned about Harold hours earlier. The cemetery workers, initially expecting to handle a quick routine burial, found themselves part of something far more meaningful. Harold Edmund Whitfield served his country during the Korean War, far from home, in conditions we can barely imagine. Reverend Patterson began. Today we gather not because we knew Harold personally, but because we recognize that his service represents the sacrifice of an entire generation who answered their nation's call. David Roberts stepped forward carrying a British Legion wreath that had been hastily purchased by the assembled veterans. As the senior military representative present, he had been chosen to speak on behalf of Harold's wartime generation. Harold, we don't know if you had family who loved you, friends who remembered you, or colleagues who valued your contributions to civilian life after your military service. David said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, but we know that you served alongside thousands of other young men in Korea, and that service created bonds that transcend time and personal acquaintance. James felt profound emotion as he watched the elderly veterans participate in the ceremony. These men, some requiring assistance to stand, had made significant efforts to attend the funeral of a stranger because they understood something about military service that transcended individual relationships. As the service continued, an unexpected addition to the ceremony began to unfold. Captain William Harrison, James's commanding officer, arrived at the cemetery in a staff car, accompanied by a small detail from the household cavalry. He had been following the developments throughout the day and decided that the regiment should be properly represented at what had become a significant military funeral. Lance Corporal Mackenzie, Captain Harrison, said quietly as he approached James, "Outstanding initiative today. The regiment is proud of your actions." The presence of the household cavalry detail added formal military protocol to the proceedings. They brought with them a Union Jack to drape over Harold's coffin and a bugler to play the last post, transforming the simple burial into a full military funeral with all appropriate honors. Dr. Patricia Wells, military historian, took notes on the ceremony while reflecting on the broader significance of what she was witnessing. This spontaneous tribute to Harold represented something important about how societies remember their veterans and the power of individual initiative to create meaningful change. "What's happening here today?" she quietly explained to Jenny Martinez. "The newspaper reporter demonstrates that military service creates bonds that extend far beyond active duty. These veterans and current soldiers understand that Harold's individual story is part of their shared story." As the bugler played the last post, the clear notes echoing across the cemetery, every person present stood in respectful silence. The haunting melody seemed to bridge the decades between Harold's wartime service and the present moment, honoring not just his individual sacrifice, but the service of all who had worn the uniform. Following military tradition, the honor guard performed a final salute as Harold's coffin was lowered into the ground. The precision and dignity of their movements stood in stark contrast to the lonely burial that had been planned. Just hours earlier, Elizabeth Hartwell watched the proceedings with tears in her eyes. Overwhelmed by the transformation she had witnessed, her professional experience had taught her that funerals were about honoring lives and providing closure for the living. But today's service had exceeded anything she had previously experienced. After the formal ceremonies concluded, the attendees lingered at the graveside, reluctant to end what had become an extraordinary shared experience. The veterans exchanged contact information and stories, creating connections that might not have existed without Harold's funeral bringing them together. "Sergeant." Sarah Collins approached James as the crowd began to disperse. "What you started here today has reminded all of us why military service matters," she said. "Harold may have died alone, but he certainly wasn't buried alone." James nodded, still processing the magnitude of what had unfolded from his simple decision to attend the funeral of a veteran he had never met. The empty chapel that morning had become a gathering of dozens of people who understood that honoring service was not just about personal relationships, but about maintaining the values and traditions that define military communities. As the last mourners prepared to leave the cemetery, David Roberts approached Harold's grave one final time. He placed his hand on the fresh earth and spoke quietly, as if addressing Harold directly. "Rest in peace, Harold. Your service mattered, your sacrifice is remembered, and your story will not be forgotten." The words carried across the cemetery, providing a fitting conclusion to a funeral that had demonstrated the enduring power of military brotherhood and community respect for those who serve their country. In the days following Harold's funeral, the story of the Korean War veteran who had nearly been buried alone began to spread far beyond the small community that had gathered to honor him. Jenny Martinez's article in the local newspaper, titled "Community Honors Forgotten Veteran," captured the attention of readers who were moved by the account of how one young soldier's act of respect had transformed a lonely burial into a celebration of service. The story was picked up by national newspapers, military magazines, and social media platforms, where it resonated with people across the country who understood the importance of recognizing veterans' sacrifices. Comments poured in from readers sharing similar stories of elderly veterans who had died without family, and communities that had come together to ensure they received proper military honors. James found himself unexpectedly thrust into the spotlight as the story gained national attention. His commanding officer, Captain Harrison, called him into his office 3 days after the funeral to discuss the media interest and its implications for the regiment. "Mackenzie, your actions have brought positive attention to the military and have reminded the public about our obligations to veterans," Captain Harrison said. "The Ministry of Defense has received numerous inquiries about how civilians can help ensure that veterans receive appropriate funeral honors." James felt somewhat overwhelmed by the attention his simple act of respect had generated. "Sir, I just did what I thought was right. I never expected it to become such a big story." "That's exactly why it has resonated with people," Captain Harrison explained. "Genuine acts of respect and duty have power precisely because they're not performed for recognition." The response to Harold's story led to concrete changes in how veteran funerals were handled across the country. The Royal British Legion announced new protocols for ensuring that no veteran would be buried without appropriate military representation. And several veterans organizations began coordinating with funeral directors to identify upcoming services. For former military personnel without family, Dr. Patricia Wells, military historian who had attended Harold's funeral, used the story as the opening chapter of her book about Korean War veterans. She had been deeply moved by the ceremony and saw it as a perfect example of how communities could honor forgotten generations of servicemen and women. Harold's funeral demonstrated something crucial about memory and respect, Dr. Wells wrote. In her introduction, Korean War veterans were indeed forgotten by much of society. But they were not forgotten by each other. And they were not forgotten by the current generation of soldiers who understand the continuity of military service. Elizabeth Hartwell received dozens of letters from families across the country thanking her for ensuring that Harold received a dignified funeral. Many shared stories of their own elderly relatives who had died alone, and several offered to donate money to help cover funeral expenses for future cases involving veterans without family. "Harold's story has touched something deep in people's hearts," Elizabeth told a reporter from the BBC. "I think it reminds us all that every person's life has value and that military service creates obligations that extend far beyond active duty." The veteran community itself was profoundly affected by the story and the response it generated. David Roberts, the elderly Royal Engineers veteran who had helped organize the attendance at Harold's funeral, found himself at the center of a network of Korean War veterans who had been inspired to reconnect with each other and share their experiences. "Harold brought us together in death in a way that we hadn't managed in life," David explained during a television interview. "His funeral reminded us that our experiences in Korea were significant and that our service should be remembered." Several months after the funeral, a permanent memorial was erected at Harold's gravesite, funded by donations from people who had been moved by his story. The simple headstone was replaced with a more substantial memorial that included his military service details and an inscription reading, "Served with honor, remembered with respect." James was invited to the dedication ceremony for the memorial, where he met Harold's former care facility staff who had followed the story with interest. They shared memories of Harold's gentle nature and his reluctance to speak about his military service. painting a picture of a modest man who would have been amazed by the attention his funeral had received. "Harold was always polite and grateful," said Maria Santos, one of his former caregivers. "He never complained about being alone, but I could tell he was lonely. I think he would have been overwhelmed by how many people came to honor him." The story had also inspired other young soldiers to take similar actions. Military personnel across the country began volunteering to attend funerals for veterans without family, ensuring that the precedent set by James's attendance at Harold's service would continue. Sergeant Sarah Collins, who had been among the serving soldiers who attended Harold's funeral, established a formal program within the Royal Logistics Corps to identify and attend veteran funerals in their area. "Harold's story taught us that honoring veterans isn't just about official ceremonies," she explained. "It's about maintaining the bonds of military service across generations." The broader impact of Harold's story extended to how British society thought about its obligations to veterans. Parliamentary discussions were held about improving support for elderly veterans, and funding was allocated for programs designed to prevent veterans from becoming isolated in their final years. James often reflected on how his simple decision to attend a stranger's funeral had created ripple effects he never could have imagined. The empty chapel that he had expected to find that October afternoon had become the starting point for a national conversation about respect, remembrance, and the ongoing obligations that military service creates. "I just thought someone should be there," James told a documentary crew that was filming a program about Harold's story. "I never expected it to lead to all this, but I'm glad it has." Harold deserved to be remembered, and maybe his story will help ensure that other veterans are remembered too. 1 year after Harold's funeral, James received an invitation that would bring the story full circle in the most unexpected way. Dr. Patricia Wells, military historian whose book about Korean War veterans had become a bestseller, had been contacted by the Ministry of Defense with extraordinary news about Harold's background. Through extensive research prompted by the attention his story had received, military historians had uncovered previously classified documents that revealed Harold's service had been far more distinguished than anyone had realized. During the Battle of Imjin River in April 1951, Harold had volunteered for a dangerous mission to repair a critical bridge under heavy enemy fire, enabling the evacuation of wounded soldiers and preventing a potential military disaster. The mission had been classified for decades due to its sensitive nature, and Harold's role had never been properly recognized. The discovery of these documents led to a decision by the Ministry of Defense to posthumously award Harold the Military Cross for extraordinary gallantry, making him one of the few national service soldiers to receive such a high decoration for actions in Korea. The presentation ceremony was held at the Imperial War Museum, with Harold's Military Cross being formally presented to James. As the representative of the military community that had honored Harold's memory, the ceremony was attended by many of the same people who had gathered for his funeral, including the elderly Korean War veterans, current serving soldiers, and community members who had been moved by his story. "Harold Edmund Whitfield represents the best of British military tradition," said General Sir Nicholas Carter, who presented the posthumous award. His actions during the Korean War saved lives and demonstrated exceptional courage under fire. That he carried out these heroic acts and then returned to civilian life without seeking recognition speaks to his character and the character of his generation. James accepted the medal on Harold's behalf with deep emotion, understanding that he was holding recognition that Harold had earned but never received during his lifetime. The weight of the medal seemed to represent not just Harold's individual courage, but the service of all the Korean War veterans whose contributions had been overlooked for too long. David Roberts, now 88 years old but still sharp and dignified, spoke at the ceremony about the broader significance of Harold's recognition. "Harold's story has reminded our nation that heroism often goes unrecognized, that sometimes the most important acts of courage are performed by ordinary people who simply do their duty." The ceremony was attended by representatives from the South Korean government, who expressed gratitude for Harold's service and the service of all British forces who had fought in their country. The Korean ambassador presented a special commendation, acknowledging Harold's contribution to Korean independence and reconstruction. The bridge that Harold repaired under fire helped save hundreds of lives, the ambassador explained. His courage and dedication are remembered with gratitude by the Korean people. Following the ceremony, a permanent exhibit about Korean War veterans was unveiled at the Imperial War Museum, featuring Harold's story as a central element. The exhibit included photographs from his funeral, testimonials from the people who had attended, and artifacts from his military service that had been preserved by the Ministry of Defense. James, who had been promoted to corporal following his exemplary service record, was asked to be the military advisor for the exhibit. Working with Dr. Wells and museum curators, he helped create displays that honored not just Harold, but the entire generation of British servicemen who had fought in Korea. The exhibit opening was attended by hundreds of Korean War veterans and their families, many of whom had traveled from across the country to see their service finally receiving proper recognition. For many, it was the first time their military experiences had been publicly acknowledged and celebrated. Elizabeth Hartwell attended the museum opening, reflecting on how Harold's simple funeral had led to this national recognition of Korean war service. Harold would have been amazed, she told James during the reception. He was such a modest man who never sought attention, but his story has helped ensure that an entire generation of veterans receives the recognition they deserve. Impact of Harold's story continued to grow in ways that exceeded everyone's expectations. The Royal British Legion established the Harold Whitfield Memorial Fund to ensure that no veteran would be buried without appropriate honors. And the fund had already helped coordinate military funerals for dozens of veterans across the country. James often visited Harold's grave, which had become a place of pilgrimage for people moved by his story. The simple cemetery plot now featured a substantial memorial garden, plaques honoring Korean War veterans, and a bench where visitors could sit and reflect on service and sacrifice. During one of these visits, James encountered an elderly woman placing flowers on Harold's grave. She introduced herself as Margaret Kim, a Korean immigrant whose family had been evacuated across the bridge that Harold had repaired under fire in 1951. "My father was wounded during the battle," explained. Harold's actions allowed him to be evacuated and treated, which saved his life. "Without Harold's courage, I would never have been born. I come here every month to thank him." James realized that Harold's story had international resonance, connecting British military service to the lives of people around the world who had been affected by that service. The lonely veteran who had died without family had, in death, revealed connections and impact that spanned continents and generations. As James stood in the memorial garden, surrounded by evidence of how Harold's story had touched thousands of lives, he reflected on the lesson he had learned. One person's simple act of respect and recognition could create ripple effects that extended far beyond anything they could imagine. Harold Edmund Whitfield had served with distinction, lived quietly, and died alone. But his story had become a powerful reminder that every life has value. Every service member's contribution matters, and sometimes the most important recognition comes not during life, but through the respect and remembrance of others who understand the meaning of sacrifice. The young Royal Guard, who had simply wanted to ensure that a veteran wasn't buried alone, had helped create a legacy that would honor military service for generations to come. Harold's final resting place had become a symbol of remembrance, respect, and the enduring bonds that connect all who serve their country.